Welcome. My name is Grant Ingersoll. I'm the CTO and co-founder of Lucidworks. Great to see so many people here from the Lucene and Solr community. Really looking forward to the next 2 days. As you no doubt guessed, I've got a little bit of a retro theme here, and what I wanted to do is kind of explore the different ways I think we all as kids in engaging with video games learned about search. And so as we do this, I want this to be a little bit interactive. We're going to go through and show some of my favorite games. Perhaps they're some of your favorite games. And so if you see your favorite game up there, I want to encourage you to shout it out when you first see it. And then I also want you to, if I missed a game or I missed an analogy around a video game and search, I would encourage you to tweet me at @GSingers or the Lucene Solr Rev hashtag as we go here. So as we get into thinking about search and video games and best practices, I wanted to start off with a lot of the common pitfalls that we see. So first off, in my job, I go out and I visit a lot of customers, and I visit a lot of you, and I know a lot of you first-hand basis, or first-name basis, and I really get to know some of the troubles you're having as you think about your data, as you think about search. And often it's the case that as a developer, I think one of the things that's really hard about search is that we are all trained on relational logic and on databases. And so when we shift to this fuzzy world of search, we often have to rethink how we go about our practices. And so with that, some of the common pitfalls that we see, first and foremost, how many of you developers know how to code HTML and JavaScript and CSS? Just a quick show of hands, right? I do too. And you know what? My UX guy, he can tell me, yeah, Grant, you know how to code JavaScript and CSS, but you know what? You're not very good at it. And so what often happens when us engineers, who are especially back-end engineers and doing Solr and doing search, when we go and build front-end user interfaces, we think, oh, well, we've got the user interface down, but guess what? It often looks like this. Because what's often happening is we're not thinking about, as back-end engineers, the user experience. We're just so concentrated on making sure we can put those 10 blue links up on the page that we forget about what are the user's workflow. What are they doing with this data? What is the goal for it? And so one of the biggest pitfalls, I think, is we don't spend enough time thinking about how our users engage with the application. This really hit home for me at Lucidworks a couple of years ago, and admittedly, you know, one of the things and one of my biases when I think about this stuff is I'm like, well, it's all text, right? Who cares about user interface? Who cares how it looks? Who cares how we engage with it, right? We're just reading things, right? It's all text. And so in a lot of our early days of our applications, I think that came across, and we didn't spend enough time and we didn't invest enough as a company in the user experience. That has all changed with Fusion. In the past 2 years, we've invested a lot in the UI and in the user experience. You also see this in Solr. One of the big complaints in Solr about a year, two or 3 years ago was that the getting started user experience was not that good. Well, we fixed all of those things, right? It's so easy to download and start and get data flowing into Solr these days. We've done that same thing with Fusion in terms of our UIs, trying to make it really easy to get data in, ask more interesting questions, and so on and so forth. Next common pitfall, I think I see this a lot. People are really obsessed with finding those perfect results. I can't tell you the number of times I've been in with customers and they say, oh, you see this result here that's number 2? Why can't that be number 1? And it's just really kind of crazy when you think about it in some ways, right? You want things to be, for the most part, I think you should think about is you want things to be above the fold. If it's above the fold on your page of results, then it's probably not a big deal. And it really shouldn't obsess too much about the second place being in first place. On the other hand, if it really should be the first one, perhaps that's the only answer you're showing, maybe you should just pin it at the top of the result. So I want to encourage you to go back and think about what are your assumptions about relevance. We'll talk a little bit later about some best practices when it comes to relevance. Next up, I often see, anybody recognize this game, by the way? By most accounts on the internet, this is the worst game ever. If you're not familiar, it's E.T. on the Atari 2600. Some people even say it actually killed the platform. Seriously. So if you think about it, like, you don't want to kill your platform, right? And so one of the things that we often see when it comes to search and relevancy is that people are stuck in the pit of despair. They're stuck in these local minimums, if you will. As you're tuning relevance, you're getting stuck just focused on certain queries. You're tuning the heck out of those queries, and you can't see the rest of the world, right? I once did, in the early days of search, I competed in the Trek conference. If you're familiar with that, it's an academic conference that goes through, and it has a standard data set and standard set of relevance judgments, and you sit and spend months on end tuning your system so that you can get just that little bit more precision out of your system. And I would spend so much time just focused on these queries, adding phrases, adding n-grams, adding all these different ways of doing this query. Also, I could just get this one little bit more percentage of precision. But in reality, I was stuck in that pit because what I was failing to do, what was happening is I was really focused on just a handful of queries. And I often see this with a lot of customers as well, where you have this experience, and raise your hand if you've done this or had this experience as a developer. Your boss comes in and says, "Hey Bob, hey Jane, why is query X not showing the proper results?" I like to call these pet peeve queries. And I bet you as developers, if you think about the way you test your system, I see a lot of heads nodding, the way you test your system, you probably have your own pet peeve queries as well. My very first search engine I built was doing English to French, Spanish, German, and Japanese. And I didn't know any Japanese, so I learned 2 Japanese characters so that I could test our Japanese system. Those 2 characters were Japan, just spelled out, and I still to this day can actually draw the characters, but that's the only Japanese I know, and that was my only way of testing that system. Well, guess what? When it went out to production with our customers, the results were okay, but we had missed out on a lot of things because we didn't have people focused on the broader set of queries. And so just like in one of my favorite games on the Mac back in the day, Strategic Conquest, you really need to expand out your view of the world here. You need to think about, what are your users asking of your system? You need to think about, as you're building this system, how do we collect more information about what our queries are such that we can have a broader landscape, so that when your boss comes to you and says, "Hey, how come this query is broken?" you can say, "You know what, boss? Nobody asked that query but you. And here's where we make all of our money. And so would you like me to spend time fixing your query that nobody cares about, or would you like me to focus on the ones that we actually make our money off of?" So I encourage you to think about what pet peeve queries you have. Now this one, we don't really have a game. Oprah unfortunately hasn't made a game yet. But we did a little Minecraft homage here and put her up pixelated. One of the things that's really interesting, and you see this in the broader application space, not just search, is where we all think we're geniuses. And you make some change on your site, and traffic goes up like crazy. You get more traffic, you get more traffic, you get more traffic. Everybody gets more traffic, right? And in reality, and you're sitting there, you're patting yourself on the back, marketing's super happy with you, sales is super happy with you. And in reality, what you failed to account for was that there was some other random effect that happened on your site. In the Oprah effect case, it was often the case that Oprah would mention a book or a website or something on her TV show. And of course, there was this whole landslide of traffic that came in. And here, it often correlated with companies who were looking at their analytics saying, "Oh, well, we just pushed a change to our site," or "We just adopted this social media platform." And in reality, something else was actually affecting those results. And so I would encourage you, before you start patting yourself on the back too much, make sure you have in place the checks and balances to understand what is actually working in your application. And there's a lot of good ways you can do that. Any Portal fans out there? Yeah. Great game. I think one of the interesting things that you start to think about in Portal, right, is that you can challenge kind of your assumptions about time and space, right? And you can go from one level to the other and across time and into different parts of the game, et cetera. And I think what it often in my mind leads to is really thinking about what assumptions do you have when you're building your applications, right? One of the most common assumptions that I see is, well, I didn't think Solr could do that. What do you mean I should use it as an edge cache? What do you mean I should use it as an object store, right? What do you mean that when a user types in 5 keywords, I don't want to do a search? What do you mean when a user types in keywords that I should do 5 searches? Right? There's a lot of assumptions you see in the way people interact with a search engine, right? They don't realize how fast it can be, for instance. They don't realize how effective it is for storage and other things. And so I would like to encourage you to go back and think about what assumptions do you have. I like to talk a lot about fake queries and invisible queries. Fake queries are that second case I said where just because a user types words into your text box doesn't mean you actually have to do a query, right? You might already know the answer. Just send them to the answer. These are called landing pages. Go have a landing page, right? This is very common in e-commerce. There's plenty of other places it works too in enterprise search. The other side of that, the invisible queries, right? Just because a user types a query in doesn't mean that's the only query you have to run. I've seen some places where they run up to 14 or 15 different queries because they've got this kind of cascading set of back-off queries that if they don't feel the results are good enough, they go back and change the way they're thinking about their queries, such that at the end of the day, you're still giving good, reliable results. They're just different interpretations of what the user was asking. So with that, a little bit of a segue. I had to have a Mario slide. I can't count the number of hours I wasted in college playing Super Mario Brothers. So I had to have a Mario Brothers slide. And this really is, I think, a segue then into thinking about what are some of the best practices around search? What are some of the things coming up that you should be thinking about in terms of your applications? So first off, one of the things that we see very often is people have a lot of really complicated architectures. And this kind of goes back to those assumptions, right? They have HBase over here and Hadoop and Cassandra and all of these different kinds of NoSQL stores and all of these different systems trying to interact, and a lot of it's justified, I'll give you that. But I can't help but often think about the kind of difficulty in these architectures, and it really stems from, if you think about it, distributed systems are really hard, right? So if I've got one distributed system, that's pretty hard. I've got a second one, it's a whole lot harder to keep those two in sync. And so what I encourage you to do is go back and challenge your assumptions and say, can I keep all of my data in Solr? And there are certain use cases where you really can. Usually it starts off with if search is your primary use case, then use Solr for that. And then if you have secondary use cases for things like key value stores or large table scans, all of those kinds of things, you can start to see how that becomes much more effective in Solr because you don't have to move all of the data around in between these two systems, right? And so what happens then is you get to simplify your architecture. And trust me, your DevOps and your site reliability team will really appreciate having a much simpler architecture. We've gone so far at Lucidworks, we used to have a product called Lucidworks Big Data. It was this whole amalgamation of Hadoop and HBase and Solr and all the like. And what turned out with that application is every time we looked at the way we were using HBase, and HBase is a perfectly fine NoSQL store, we realized that, boy, if Solr just had this like 10% more, We could just do this in Solr. So what did we do? We added things like a blob store to Solr so that we can just store large objects in Solr. And guess what? It performs good enough for our situations, right? We do things like we keep our machine learning models in there and just say, hey, give me the machine learning model for this classification or for this part of speech tagger or these kinds of things, right? And so that allows us to have a much simpler architecture. We still bring in other systems like Spark, but guess what? We have Spark just work right off of Solr so that we can use Solr as a data store without having to move our data out into some other system and keep that in sync. Excuse me. So I would encourage you again to think about how can you simplify, because as we all know, as you scale, the more complicated systems always break down, right? And so if you can do all of this in Solr, and I would put forth that you can do a lot more in there than you think you can, you would be a lot happier and your DevOps would be a lot happier. You would get your weekends back and have a lot more enjoyable development life. Next up, this is really starting, I think, to get into how do we start to leverage more of the data that we have. And I think one of the things that I often see is that we kind of discard time. Sure, we put on timestamps and maybe we have versions on our data and all of that kind of stuff, but we're really not incorporating time into our actual application. We're not thinking as much about recency perhaps as we should. We're not thinking about what a user is doing in their sessions and across sessions. We're not incorporating that history, that sense of time around how a user develops with your site as part of our application. And so there's been a lot of really good work in time series and you know, in search engines to enable these kinds of things. So I would encourage you to think about how you can bring time in as a factor into your applications, especially on the relevancy side, but there's also a lot of other things in terms of analyzing trends and all of that kind of stuff that you can do right out of the box in Solr. And I think you'll see more coming in this space from Lucidworks as we invest in Solr, as this is one of the key areas I think we can help you engage with your audience. Along those lines, I often see that we kind of discard spatial data. We don't think about necessarily how our data relates in time and space. Excuse me, sorry. And so I would encourage you, just like any Carmen Sandiego players back in grade school, this is one of the ways you learn geography, right? I would encourage you to think about how can we incorporate spatial data. In case you're not aware, Lucene and Solr have a really awesome spatial capability. David Smiley and a few other people, I believe David's here, have done a ton of work around making spatial be a really first-class citizen. And in fact, they've gone so far as they've really blurred the lines around what is time and space. I think Einstein would be really proud because this spatial capability in Solr, you can use it to represent lots of different kinds of data that you couldn't do before. And I encourage you to check out David's work, and Haas has done a talk on this as well, on how to use spatial capabilities for non-spatial uses. I would also encourage you to think about where do you have spatial information, right? The obvious one is, you know, you've got a user on a mobile phone sending you GPS. Great, that's easy. We can go and boost and do distance calculations off of that. We can also, though, you can think about like maybe in the enterprise search case, right, where you've got a bunch of different offices, right? Perhaps it's the case that you want documents to be tagged by their locations, right? Or perhaps you have IP information that you can do DNS lookups on and get, or do reverse DNS lookups on and get information about where this data is coming from, and then somehow leverage that. Perhaps it helps you optimize your IT operations. Perhaps it helps you get your users to their data faster. But I would really encourage you to check out the spatial capabilities, especially when you add in the JTS library. I would also encourage you to think about, there's actually a lot, you know, one of the things that I would note about the spatial is note that it doesn't say geospatial, right? This isn't just about latitudes and longitudes, right? You can actually represent whole vector spaces and all of that kind of stuff in this in these capabilities. So I encourage you to dig in and really find out what's going on with your spatial data and how you can leverage that for your users. Becoming more and more of a trend. Obviously, the likes of Google and Bing and all of those really are experimenting constantly with what we as users are doing with the site. And when I talk to many of you, you're all wondering, how do I personalize my application, right? How do I deliver results to this user over here versus that user over there, right? And so I would really encourage you, just like in the My Sims game, you want to think about how can we leverage user behavior, things like their past history, things like perhaps their gender or their segments. Are they male, female? Are they 40 to 49? Are they 18 to 25? Whatever information you can find out about your user, right? Think about ways that you can bring that into your relevance. Perhaps you want to rank results for millennials different than you rank results for 70-year-olds. I don't know, but that's really a question that you can engage with your marketing and business team and try to figure out how to do this. And I think once you see all of the ways you can incorporate this into Lucene and Solr under the hood through things like function queries and re-ranking and all of that kind of stuff, you'll find that you have a lot of capabilities for incorporating past user behavior. There's also a lot of great work out in academia on personalized search results. I would encourage you to go look at that. Next up, any Metal Gear fans? One of the things that's interesting is, it's really been happening a lot lately with search, and is actually kind of an old problem in search. If you go back to the academic literature from like the 1980s, there was this thing called document routing or document filtering. Well, it's all the rage these days, right? What do we call it? We call it alerting, right? And it's this whole idea that as data is coming in real time, you're routing your data to the appropriate people as it happens, right? So just like in Metal Gear Solid, where you were, the spy or the sniper, right, and you had to sneak around, this one's really about how do the bad guys get alerted when you do something, right? And so I want to encourage you to think about, perhaps you don't have to wait for your user to actually do a query, right? One of the ways you can think about this is like, if you have enough information from your user about perhaps where they are or what they're doing on your site, maybe they're browsing, etc., could you predict what they're doing? Could you send out an alert to them? Could you say, hey, I found this information that you were looking for last week. I know you searched for this before, and we kind of noticed you didn't really find it, but hey, we now have new information available to you. We can send you those things. We've done a lot around alerting in Fusion in terms of hooking in with systems like email and PagerDuty and Slack and the like, such that as data is flowing in or as queries are happening, you can actually send out real-time alerts. There's going to be a lot more coming in this way. We're also working, I think you'll see a lot more coming in Solr soon around things like anomaly detection. Anomaly detection being that thing where you're detecting where something's out of whack so that you can then go and send alerts. And so I would encourage you to think about, how do we leverage the data as it's flowing in and the users and send data to them without them actually putting in a query. How many of you spend a lot of time denormalizing your data? Yeah, this used to be the thing that you spent a lot of time on. I can't tell you the number of customers where they have this really complex database architecture, and we would spend weeks on end helping them denormalize and figure out what actually needs to go in the search engine. I think one of the coolest things that's been happening in the Solr community in the past say year or two is really all of the capabilities around joining data. Right? So instead of having to denormalize all of your data, you can start to leverage all of those relational capabilities that you learned in college as part of the search engine. And so just like in Tetris, where you had to make all of the blocks fit, I think you now have a lot more capabilities for understanding and relating the data in the search index itself, right? So you can start to assemble the pieces. You can ask queries that do joins across different documents, across different cores, so on and so forth. This is another area I think you'll see us as Lucidworks investing in the coming year, and I think is a really rich area for doing a lot more interesting things with your data in the index without having to move it somewhere else. We've all got mobile phones. I want to encourage you to think about, how can we bring in more voice capabilities. Admittedly, this is one of the areas in open source that's kind of weak. I've been doing a lot of research lately on good open source voice to text capabilities. There's some projects out there, they work okay, you've got to invest a lot in it, but I think this is really something where we need to dig in as a community and invest more. And if you look at the predictions around how much search traffic in the coming years is going to be voice-based, because all we want to do is ask Siri or ask Google Now or ask Solr, our question. We need to invest more and more in how we interact with voice data. And then also you have to start to think about, because those queries that we're getting via voice are natural language queries, right? Because no user is going to say, I want Justin Bieber and Britney Spears and Oprah and boost it by 5. Nobody's going to talk that way into their phone. And so you have to start to think about how we can process that natural language, identify what is the user intent of that question, and then translate that underneath the hood into the appropriate response. And that appropriate response kind of ties back into some of those earlier things. Just because the user asked a question doesn't mean we have to do a search. We could perhaps send them directly to the results. And so I think you're going to start to see search evolve much more around things like question answering, around sending them to the exact page. If we already know their answer, we can bring in things like machine learning and really try to route that user directly to what they're doing. Probably one of my favorite games, Legend of Zelda, the classic questing game. As I interact with a lot of you, this is probably the hardest thing we all face in what we do with search. Scaling right up there, but scaling tends to be a process of add more machines, try to get more efficient algorithms, which are all admittedly hard. But the really hard thing, I think, when it comes to this space is just dealing with the fuzziness of the problem, right? And so many of you, I think, are lost in the woods, right? And if you remember this particular part of The Legend of Zelda, you had to do this exact pattern. I think a lot of us are really trying to figure out what is the pattern that gives us the best relevance. But many of you are going about it just simply by putting a finger in the air. Perhaps you're doing a few pet peeve queries and saying, yeah, those results look okay. Perhaps you've got a couple of people on your team who are relevance experts. But in reality, many people are lost in the woods here. And what I think you really need to think about is putting together a plan for relevance, right? Relevance is not something that you should add on after you're in production. Can't tell you the number of people who just put in, well, relevance, the system's up and running. I'm happy as an engineer. And I can't tell you the number of people where, oh, that's marketing's job to worry about relevance. I would encourage you to think about right from the get-go with any project you're doing, have relevance be a cornerstone item in what you're doing, right? It's just as important, if not more important, than all of the scaling questions. And it's often, as an engineer, the hardest thing to get your head around, because there's this whole fuzzy nature. And there's all these pesky users who are asking questions. And why can't they just behave better, right? What you really need, though, is a plan, right? You need a plan of attack. You need to leverage your users. You need to think about how can you capture more information from them so that you can put together a reasonable plan that helps you get better. You need to incorporate lots and lots of other resources. How can you bring in marketing? How can you add more production into your capabilities? How can you democratize your data? How can you leverage all of this to then lead to better results? And we work with a lot of customers on tuning their relevance. There's a lot of great tools in Solr and Fusion for making this stuff easier and easier. And I think at the end of the day, one of my kind of core mantras in the way I work and the way I hire people and what I look for in people is this notion that you always need to be learning. Relevance is not one of those things that you just do once and then forget about it. Right? This is something that you have to incorporate into your daily existence, right? You need to think about what dashboards can you put up such that everybody on the team knows what matters in terms of relevance, and then they can also see what's happening if something goes wrong. From that, what you can start to think about is how do we capture more and more feedback, clicks, tweets, ratings, etc. How can we capture these signals and make that a part of our scoring functions? Because then what you can start to do is build things like machine learning models and related statistical analyses and all of that into the way you think right from the get-go. And this will make a big difference in terms of your relevance capabilities. Anybody die from dysentery, by the way? So with that, I just wanted to put up Phoenix Wright, the ace attorney, because I really want you to think about what you can do going forward here. One of the really interesting things that I want to leave you with is if you think about kind of us being in the golden age of computation, right? Just like newer games often are just based off of this notion of free play. Sure, they have storylines, but you know what? Most people move through those storylines pretty quick, and then they spend hours and hours doing free play. My son, this game, I don't know how many hours he's put into Elder Scrolls, but you know, he completed the storyline in like 2 days. But he plays endless number of hours just doing free play, roaming around, interacting with people. And so I want to encourage you to think about, in this era, this golden era of computation, what would you do? What can you do next with all of this computation capabilities? Things like solar cloud and massive storage and tools like Amazon have made the scaling and the storage all easier. I won't say they're easy, but they're a lot easier. And so as a community, as we think about the next generation of search, you really need to start to think about what would you do with infinite scale, unlimited storage, total fault tolerance. What are you going to build next? Right? What can you take advantage of by the fact that you have years worth of information about your users, right? Because the reality is you have nearly infinite scale available to you at your fingertips. And so I want you to think about, where can I play with my data? One of the things I think when it comes to relevance that we really want to dig in on is this notion of experimentation. As a community, I see so many people where they've got this kind of firm, you know, this iron fist of editorial control over their search results. And instead, I want you to think about, how can we experiment? I know that sounds like hippie free love and all of that good stuff, but I want to encourage you to think about, what if I don't have to be right anymore as an engineer, right? I don't have to know the perfect way to build my queries. What if I had a system that learned from the users, where I've got feedback going? And sure, I want to encourage them down certain paths, but in reality, what you want to set up is a free play environment where you're driving down the cost of experimentation. So instead of doing 2 relevance experiments a year, you're doing 2 a day or 2 a week or whatever it is that allows you to get statistically back into your application. And I think this will really kind of free up your mind to think about, what can we go do next? So with that, I want to leave you with my favorite game of all time, Miss Pac-Man. I don't really have anything to say about Miss Pac-Man in terms of an analogy, but I really felt, given the number of hours and quarters I put into this game, it at least deserved one slide. So with that, I want to thank you for your time. It's great to have you here. I'll be here all day today and tomorrow. Feel free to grab me, ask questions, and encourage you to enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.